and basically the chapter in the book that I co-wrote essentially says that when you come to confront the facts of climate change, you're also confronted with all the emotions that come with that. And it's how we contain and regulate those emotions that strongly influences whether our responses are adaptive or maladaptive. And grief is only one of many emotions. Anger is another. But my own research and other people's research shows that people have a tendency to want to suppress these difficult emotions because they're so difficult to be with. But the suppression of the emotion, it might be useful in the short term, but long term, it's we need to feel emotion. Emotion has a purpose, and difficult emotions have a purpose because it's what steers us, it's what guides us, it motivates us. And unless we can, it's the fear of what my PhD research here at Lancaster found is the fear of dysfunction by engaging with something like despair that leads people to want to suppress it because they think that it's very dualistic thinking. So it's kind of like I engage with something and it means that I kind of descend into some abyss, or I kind of suppress it in some sort of way and have some sort of false optimism, or and actually it's about how we can create structures. We don't have the social norms in this country for being able to engage with emotions in a healthy way, and for me that's why I'm interested in is how can you create safety. There needs to be some sort of containment for these emotions, and how can we as a culture make it possible for us to actually really engage with very, very difficult emotions, because the psychological threat is it we have a stress response to threat, and it's about the anxiety that comes with the stress that leads people to want to run away from it. And so I find it kind of interesting that we can sort of have a very intellectual conversation about it now, but the words that people are using are indicate some of the emotion that's going on underneath.
And did you want to? You had your hand up, Mary, but should we just?
Yeah, I think my concern is the idea that we can cure all this by our own efforts might be part of the hubris that has got us in this place in the first place. And I think what we need is not the idea that this is a problem to be solved, but that we need to reconnect with the earth in a completely different way and have a much more, unleash our humanity as part of, the life on planet Earth, really.
Thank you. That's a great way to finish.
So yeah, I mean we've put a great big challenge in front of everybody here. Go away and meet that challenge. Start small by buying a book. If you buy one of our books, you also get a free book token. It's got a little message on the back. You don't get a book token with Mike's book, but you do get Mike's book. So,
there's refreshments out in the foyer there. I close the door because of noise and people down. So do stay and help yourself.
Thank you, Anne and John.
How we can foster the ability or encourage people or enable people to take initiatives in times of when the unexpected happens, and to cope with situations like that. So I don't know whether you could just get into 3 or 4s, or you could do it in pairs if you like. So perhaps we'll have 10 minutes of that, and then we'll have a more general discussion. Is that okay?
Are we on 4?
don't know why that. Is it one of those you just look on the screen? Just left. Do you want to keep it up?
Yeah, that's the question.
Oh yeah. Keep in mind.
I've got rid of it. There we are. It's gone. You have to click on refresh.
Oh, right,
How many did we start at confront?
Something different.
Yeah.
Years.
I don't know how to I haven't really looked at it. I've got some scrap pieces of paper. And I've got the numbers of books I've got now. I've got the numbers of books that went and the numbers of books that got taken away, but I haven't sat down and looked at how. I've got quite a lot left though. I've got 20.
When we come to discussion, emphasising not just
I also heard the story anecdotes who said that it was actually a great show. They started talking to their neighbours, the kids knew they had a
to say something to start. That's what I did.
not necessarily first, because you've got lots of
But if nobody steps forward, that's all I have to do.
I mean, I, you know, if need be, I want to do this because I think we need to think about the system change that is needed to enable people to take positions are great enough to call transformation.
I think no, they're not really.
The doors open by a hand.
I mean, adaptations just always sound a bit too soon.
Yeah, no,
I think if people speak to someone else, keep asking whatever they're going to talk to someone else. Keep away from being so independent. Make sure it's all up and sort of weight off the mind. All that's going on. It's the biggest thing. Think about the water comes out. Yeah, I think
Yeah, I'll check.
learn from what happens to them. But if you go to those communities now and ask them, we provide them they'll say some good things come out. When there's a threat,
just leaving town so quick and presumably they go somewhere where it's going to be something like that. Many of them work, they still have to work, but some people are only giving what happens if something happens, they give ladies,
They weren't allowed to stay in their rooms because they were unsafe. Yeah, the rooms aren't safe for fire. Really bad. And then when the power came on, was it just like
Of course, 10 minutes, which I haven't quite yet.
On the Wednesday,
Going to the Green Party, anybody can go. You can only vote if you're a member. So presumably a member. No, it's nice. Talking about how I think she found it a bit
Was it her first one?
emotional coming back to say about how you felt was it
Going on, we just managed to get design probate, but there's still forms to sign.
Is it just your sister?
Yeah. Replacement?
You like to the
That was your dad died. My dad died. That was all a bit not quite sudden, but
Victoria Vision Council, that was funny because the buses were going over.
and then
With these extreme
the fellow was getting out of bed, broke his leg, they took him to hospital, and he was in hospital,
Concrete base has been completely undermined.
they didn't even know what they were doing. It wasn't really clear how serious it was.
For years.
At one point, the doctor came up said, oh, he's got 4 years. And they said, well, they
3 years ago, yeah. All these 250-year-old bridges got
so
knocked
then you
out.
know that it's, and then we all said, dropped everything and rushed out. And he died.
Burnside, they function on a regular basis.
So I saw it twice. Yeah, they said, oh, we're trying to get money up so we could do the biopsy. And we had no
One time.
I mean, I'm not, in some ways, I'm not upset that he died. Polio when he was
So really satisfying. And I bet, yeah, but I bet it's really satisfying to know that you made
and he actually had a really active life considering he had polio. But it does, as you get older, you must
Charging up so much, don't
hate it.
Especially smart.
I reckon you should probably
Okay, shall we I'd like to bring your conversations to a bit of a close. You can always carry on with them afterwards. So I was wondering whether anybody's got anything they want to contribute or ask questions of John or me or Mike. Or
We've got a couple of sharers. One is wireless connections and wireless radios.
So, sorry, can you just stand up, Mike? I can't hear what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, wind-up torches and wind-up radios, really cool things.
Oh, right.
And the other thing was whether, like as the City Council, responsible for a lot of planning, have ever factored in to their planning decisions things which would assist for a more robust.
Yes.
Because, like I'm aware, we were talking about here when the power went off. They couldn't use the power from the wind turbine because they didn't have the way of isolating it from the main grid, which apparently they do now. And also, from what I've heard, they'd like a second turbine, but there's a problem with the planning stage. So that sounds like the City Council haven't taken on board, the planners haven't taken on board ways of assisting with the creation of a more robust, flexible local infrastructure.
Yes, well that is it. Could discuss that again.
I know that you obviously know Caroline Jackson. Caroline did quite a lot of work on
Do you want to stand up actually, girl, so that everybody can hear?
Caroline did quite a lot of work. Caroline Jackson's one of the Community Council, and she did quite a lot of work with the local communities and hosting an event in the town hall. And one of the things that she did was drew from groups of people in Caton and Overton, what they'd done, how they approached, what systems they had. But I think one of the things that when Caroline was saying what she's done, it was easier in some of the villages because Caton and Overton and some of the places have clear geographical boundaries. And what we talked at that meeting was that it would be good if maybe the areas in Lancaster like Sperton, Vale, things like that had their own kind of emergency plans.
Yeah, I know that the emergency planning officer at Lancaster City Council, he came, I organised an event about dealing with extreme weather a couple of years ago in the Meeting House, and the emergency planning officer from the City Council came to talk. And so, like someone like Sunderland Point has had an emergency plan for a long time, for understandable reasons, but since Storm Desmond, he then got a lot more interest particularly for the villages, but he was struggling with the urban areas. Now, since then, I know that there are, the Marsh Community Centre, the Ridge, St Thomas's, they've all sort of set up as emergency centres. But places like Morecambe, for example, there's quite a lot of areas in Morecambe that really don't have any community buildings. And I think that sort of demonstrates that, there's an American writer, he wrote about the, I talk about him in there. he wrote a load of stuff about the Chicago heat wave, and there's something else that he argues that to survive climate change, what you need is a good community, and because they're the people that are going to help run the chips down. Any other or anything for thoughts from earlier on when John was talking?
I did think when you were saying we need to change our thinking fast, and there's also sort of cultural issues that are preventing fast change. I just thought if we had random power cuts in London and things would people's way of thinking suddenly change.
Well, I guess part of the pitch of the book is that random power cuts are going to become more frequent, and as it were, the extreme is going to become normalised. But let me just widen this out in response to that. Wind-up torches are great and fun. There is a certain Boy Scoutish air about wind-up torch and about coping, in Anne's terms. The system changes that are going to be necessary, the defragilisation that's going to be necessary to enable people to cope, are in some transformative. They mean handing real control back to the communities that are going to be thrown back on their coping resources. They mean building resistance at community level. And this is inescapably about power. It's about transforming power relations. Centralised systems typically do not give up power voluntarily or easily when compelled. And if we extend this across the whole sphere in which local resilience is going to be crucial, we find ourselves talking about revolution, and that takes us to the scale of the transformative scale of the changes that we're talking about. Now, coming back to what Mike said about the odds, I think what the book is about is finding a realistic space for hope for that scale of change, which nevertheless has to be entertained terrifyingly against overwhelming odds. It's not about defeat and gloom, it's about how you have to understand hope and the power and the energy of hope when you are also being honest about the scale of the odds against you.
Mike, did you want to say something in response to that?
Well, I found myself thinking about Extinction Rebellion a little bit. So I spent some time hanging out sort of between the four different sites there, and feeling all feeble in all of these fantastic people doing and the stuff they were doing. But I did think there was something on the there was a lot of seamless adaptation that I saw. So I thought there'd be chaos and loads of people really fed up and with all the mess that's going on in London. Actually, I saw barely any of that at all. And I was really sort of going around London, all around that area for days, and I did see an awful lot of seamless adaptation, and people just enjoying the place more, because in many ways, the Waterloo Bridge was absolutely beautiful, and if you were visiting London, you could stroll down Whitehall, so loads and loads of people just enjoyed the fresh air more. And I know some people might have been seriously inconvenienced, sure, I get that, but there was also a lot of, the sort of fear we have. God, what would happen if you blocked off the roads in London? Actually, most people just fine, or even better off, managed to cycle when they wouldn't otherwise do it and stuff. So we're in fear of the change, the change from business as usual and life as usual. But actually, loads of it, when we do it, it'll actually be great. And we just need to sort of, get our heads around that. But there was something, you talk about revolution, I'm thinking there's something, there was something really clever about Extinction Rebellion, the way that they was just so insistent on respect of absolutely everybody, allowed them to get away with stuff, allowed things to happen in a way that would otherwise have been much more problematic, I think. So I don't know what the answer, but there's something about, we do need to do something we've never done before, and maybe there's some clues in the way, some of the ways that was done.
Yes, I think Extinction Rebellion is a very hopeful and a very important sign. But just coming back to, as it were, the tragic sense of life, it's worth bearing in mind that rebellions either precipitate revolution or they're crushed. Now, they can be crushed by, as it were, kindly patronage, as when Parliament declares a climate emergency and then forgets about it, or when the authorities, when the novelty of significant disruption begins to wear thin and the patience of the authorities begins to wear off, they will be crushed by force. So Extinction Rebellion is a vitally important sign, but we've got to see where it's going.
Yeah, totally.
My analysis isn't the current system, which is really not fit for purpose. And I've seen, name's going my head, a professor here who got a TED talk on how unfit for purpose the existing industrial military system is for producing stuff. Isn't there a sense in which it's crushing itself under the weight of its own redundancy? Because it just doesn't operate well anymore, and it's just sort of like imploding in on itself.
I don't think we can wait for it to happen.
Yeah.
I agree, but I'm just wondering to what extent it's rebelling against itself through denial of denying the need to adapt.
So did you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. I just Becky was Lancaster and remind us of things. Just on the question of the odds, I think it's really, if you're placing odds on something that people are doing or not doing, the placing of the odds influences those odds. Right? This is the economics problem. Studying people changes people, and that's really important because I do know that that what you're saying isn't a kind of we're all doomed message. But the more things are interpreted that way, the worse those odds get. And I just think we really need to bear that in mind. Which is why I think I want to go back to where John started about the definition of we, because if we keep that undifferentiated, we ourselves and we humanity, I find that becomes incredibly demotivating, and I think there's an element of sort of green movement self-flagellation here, that people like us who like to talk about these things get in more and more rooms and talk about these difficult questions, and we're ignoring the fact that most people out there don't have these conversations. And so I don't want to talk about like hope or despair. Personally, this is a personal thing, but increasingly I feel anger at people who get away with organisations, countries who get away with high emissions, and I want to turn this into a politics of high emissions and the problems with high emitters. And I feel that actually that anger is quite energising, and I think that's what brought people out on the streets. I think that's what brings the school strikers out. So I suppose my issue is more one of the sort of tone of these debates, which I actually react really strongly against. Which is for me to ponder why I react like that, for sure, and I do. But I would also ask people here to think about why we are in this room. We all share the same sorts of views, and why we are so keen to talk about this and not have that debate in a way that would be possible in wider environments.
I'd like to echo that, and I think something that Mike said earlier about the cloud lifting. If loads of things were happening and it was exciting that we were achieving things, everyone in this room would feel energised by that. But we have to remember that there's a whole host of people out there that, for argument's sake, would vote for Trump if he was here, that don't yet even see it the way we do. And so I think there's certainly an onus on every one of us to try and have conversations and lead by example, try and get people to see it and make changes themselves.
I mean, just on that point, I think Becky's absolutely right. Facing the odds can change the odds. The point is, you don't do that on the basis of a rational calculation of the odds. You do it because you invest in hope, as it were, from ground level. If those out there who are not in here don't get angry soon, we're stuffed, right? That's what Extinction Rebellion is about. It has to happen. That's one of the things you have to hope for.
I mean, there's certainly a lot of anger out there. I'm just on the... That's fine, I can see lots of people. I've been thinking more about this getting angry at the consumption of the really rich, particularly after reading Mike's book, actually, about, because he's got loads of stuff about inequality in it, which I think is really interesting. Like, did you know, I've been telling people this, did you know that most Italians are wealthier than most Americans, even though, America is a richer country than Italy. But it's made me think things like, well, if we're going to get through, the things that we need to do to tackle, to reduce emissions sufficiently, to keep fossil fuels in the ground, perhaps we need to do things that specifically target the really wealthy, so like ban private jets, ban business class air travel, because then it'd be uncomfortable for them. But anyway, that's my little contribution.
Sorry, can I turn it on its head? Because it's the developed world as a whole.
Sorry?
It's the developed world as a whole that's creating, generating a lot of the carbon dioxide emissions. And actually, every single person has a responsibility within that in terms of personal lifestyle choices that we actually make. And that's something that's in everybody's individual gift that collectively can make a difference.
Is that correct? Because isn't it major countries like China and India that are, as countries are producing, but it's a factor of population, not a factor of individual use, would be my understanding of the situation.
Well,
China has more emissions than us, but per person we have more emissions than them.
That's it.
Yeah.
So and this is the thing when you're talking about countries, because somebody was saying about the countries that are high emitters, but they're high emitters because the poorer countries are high emitters because they've got massive populations.
And because we have exported such a lot of our industrial production out there. That's why China and India, between them, add a coal-fired power station a week at the moment. And if that's not kept in mind, the whole situation becomes
I mean, there is an argument that actually, we consume fossil fuels through technological systems, through, our transport system, the whole electrification system, urbanisation, and it's not simply a matter of population. And yes, there are things we can do individually, but actually perhaps it's more important is changing the system that we live in. Because there is a limit to individual agency in this, I think. So, did you want to come?
Yeah, I do. I want to come back on Becky's thing about who do we talk to, and I think I think it's right. I think that's right. So in these global futures things, there is a kind of a like-minded group, and I'm always keen that and I think there is a place for that as well. I think it's good to talk among, because that's how you work up your thinking about what you might do in many ways, and equally, it's really important to try and widen that group and get more of the management school in here and all the rest of it, but even wider than that. But back to Extinction Rebellion again. One of the things they were really clever about was there was this call for just absolute respect for everybody. And so I'm going to go and talk to the Conservatives Association in Westmoreland soon, and I can't wait. But because it's like a rare opportunity to go and have that really different conversation. but I've just had an email from them now, and I realise they're terrified of it as well. You know, and they want to talk to me in advance, have a pre-meeting about what are we going to do about all the different. And I'm thinking, you know, but I'm thinking there's something. You know, this has to be a really respectful. Because I totally you know, how often do I even talk to anyone who's Conservative? I mean, you know I'm in a bubble, and I know that my book more or less says. It's not quite explicit, but it does say don't vote Conservative, really. And, but yeah, I really respect the fact that they've asked me to come and talk. You know, and I know that they are, you know, they're human beings just like me and all the rest of it. And we have to, you know, we have to bring our mind. And there were loads of people who, you know, would look at my lifestyle and say, well, how on earth can he have the same things he says when he lives like that? You know, I know that. I mean, I know that I'm conflicted, and we're all conflicted to some degree. So we're all kind of.
So that's your challenge for the evening. Yeah. Think respectfully about Boris Johnson for 10 minutes.
Sorry, yes. I only learned this week what a citizens' assembly was, and to me it seems like a really fascinating way to try and work through all these things of we all have different perspectives and getting people that don't agree with you in a room. And Rory Stewart, the MP for Penrith area, I don't know if he's going to be at the talk we're giving, he is the only Tory person who's actually suggested the idea of a citizens' assembly, and he understands it as well. And what do you think about that as a way forward? Do you think is that how the revolution could happen?
Do you want to say something, Mike?
My one line, I think it's a really hopeful experiment in the evolution of democracy. I think that, you know, I don't know much about them. Becky knows far more about them than I do, and I think I'm totally welcoming of them.
Yeah.
Isn't Rory Stewart the Conservative candidate that everybody who doesn't vote Conservative
Yeah, I don't know about citizens' assemblies. I mean, I've had a bit of experience of that sort of process there was some stuff done here a few years ago about looking at nuclear waste, and it sort of just, which I was a bit part of, took to have some little part in it as a sort of, I think I was yeah, anyway. So it does depend on how it's set up and exactly who feeds into it and all that sort of stuff. But it's worth a go, I think. Becky, do you want to say, have you done any work on citizens' assemblies?
Yeah, lots. And Mike summed it up brilliantly in terms of a hopeful experiment in democracy. I mean, to link back to the earlier discussion about, you know, where are the Tories on this? Well, you know, roughly, I don't know, if the population is divided into roughly half, this is gross simplification, but half right-wing, half left-wing, let's just imagine it's that, okay? We need to include half the population in a solution.
Yeah.
So, I'm personally, it's not my politics, but I am really interested, I work with Tory MPs on this, about what a, maybe, let's say centre-right response to the climate crisis might be. Okay, and I absolutely think we need to have those discussions. By the way, I think a centre-right solution to the centre-right response to the climate crisis would probably involve something about the ultra-rich and ultra-high emitters. But anyway, so through a citizens' assembly, you can incorporate people's values, which won't be your political values necessarily, and you can start to have a serious deliberation, and it would mean that those of us who have views like people in the room would actually be talking through with people of very different politics and outlooks about how we deal with this existential crisis. And all the experience of citizens' assemblies, and the one in Ireland is probably the best example of what happens. When you have that space and time to deliberate, people have very, very sensible answers and can chart a way through. So I have every faith in the process to come out with the right answers. What then happens to those answers and who takes them forward is a huge issue.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the crunch issue, because I think citizens' assemblies are fine, and it's important that Extinction Rebellion are calling for that as one of their 3 points. But they need to happen in the context of, as it were, a green political protagonist. That is, let's put it crudely, ready to take power when the present system loses its legitimacy, which if it doesn't over the next 10 or 12 years, again, we're stuffed. Now at the moment, our green political protagonist, bless it, couldn't take over a robust branch of the Rotarians, never mind. Let me be provocative. I don't really think that it's yet got itself set up for the kind of change that it needs to be involved in making happen. I'll just throw that out.
So we just respond to that in terms of Caroline Lucas. Actually, I'm not actually Green or Labour or anything, I try to stay out of politics. But Caroline Lucas has started to initiate a conversation where she's recognising that there's commonality between a lot of people who voted to leave the EU because they're at the wrong end of the financial service-driven poverty, the inequality that's growing. They're at the wrong end of that, and they're trying to do something about it with limited resources. And the people that want to bring about a green, sustainable world, there is a commonality. She's trying to initiate conversations between the two groups. So I think partly it comes down to personal awareness of the problem and people taking strategic steps to nudge things in the right direction, and then those people talking to each other in a round table way. It's also maybe that's where you get your revolutionary government.
Yeah.
Sorry,
and then Mandy.
I beg your pardon. Is it me?
Yes, it is you. Yeah.
I think another distinction that needs to be made, to be brought in, is we're talking about individual responsibility, but there's changing the legal framework within which they operate. Now, to take the example of plastics, Michael Gove has been talking and promising this by 2045 or whatever. And there is scope actually for quite radical action to force supermarkets to use recyclable plastic materials and just do it. You can have consultations and all the rest of it. And I think another part of it is that the approach of nudge and the think tanks that are operated in that arena, I think have concluded that it has a limited impact and that you need much clearer, tighter frameworks. And I think there's a role for the council, isn't Lancaster City Council looking at trying to get much clearer information out to people about which of all the different plastics are recyclable. Because it's all the councils have different approaches and it's very hard to tell. And the labelling is extremely unhelpful.
I mean, on the plastics issue, I think the critical thing would be to stop taking oil out of the ground. Because we don't recycle plastics because oil is too cheap. I mean, I've got a friend that he works in the waste industry, he was involved in setting up a hard plastics recycling facility, and then the oil price went through the floor and it wasn't viable anymore, and they sort of mothballed it or something. So it's not really about, individual behaviour, great, better facilities for recycling, great, but we need to think about what happens to the stuff afterwards and the whole economics of materials use and what is cheap and what isn't. And the problem is that oil is too cheap. And if we just stuck it out of the ground, and then you'd have to recycle the plastic because you couldn't make virgin stuff anymore. So that's my prerogative as chair.
Just to sort of, I'm sorry, was somebody...
So
my concern or despair, I've been in post as a newly elected Green councillor for 1 month. I was at a training session today about finance of the council, how it's financed. I'm not an economist, so it was all rather bewildering and surprising. And what I was most depressed about, I suppose, was that Lancaster City Council collects £25 million in business rates, but then we have to give that to central government, and they give us £5 million back. But that's more than a lot of other councils get, because we have to demonstrate that we have growth. Growth. So this is the thing that really bugs me, is that isn't climate change all linked with growth and more CO2 going into the environment? And how are we to break down? How are we to unlock this obsession that growth is key to success and drives the economy? So that's what I would ask our speakers, if they have any thoughts about that.
Do you want to say something about that first, Mike?
Well, we absolutely need to we need to rework the whole way we do economics a lot. And loads of people are saying that, it's not just me, there's, but the question is how, and that's the question, is how do you unlock it? And so, there's Kate Raworth with her donut economics and all that kind of stuff. It's bubbling away and people are saying yes, yes, yes. But then the harder question is, how do you actually make that happen? I mean, I wish I had a better answer for I could pick the right MPs and stick them in total power, and we'd be off and away, and Caroline Lucas would be one of them. But
Greenhouse's previous project, we produced a book a few years ago on it called the Post-Growth Project. So that was arguing that significant further economic growth in a country like the UK is neither feasible or desirable, and actually to stop and that we need to reorientate our economy, or this will result in massive unemployment and all sorts of other issues. So, I mean, there's various things like reducing the working week, and increasing increasing wages, because or the share of the sort of a share of income that goes to wages, for example. I wasn't so involved in writing that book, but I think one of the critical things is the government finances, because that sort of relies, the way it currently works, relies on debt, money, and the creation of, and the government relies on growth for funding services. So there's a whole can of worms there, which I haven't really got an answer to, but I could talk to you about it later.
Yes, I mean, Rupert Reed, one of our contributors, talks about what's needed in quite dramatic terms. He talks about it in terms of unleashing our humanity. Now, unleashing our humanity certainly means tying up a lot of economists and putting them back in a cupboard. But it also means millions of people growing terminally impatient with the kind of system that our Green Councillor has just described. It means that system losing its legitimacy soon.
Yeah. So I think I'll marry quick there. I think we need to draw to a close in a minute.
Right, Nadine.
Because there is stuff out there. Nadine, would you like to say something of the?
I don't know the question.
I've been trying to catch your eye. You've been students
I've
not looking.
just actually been enjoying listening, but
fine.
I mean, what can I say? One of the things which I have noticed is how people have been using words that refer to emotion, but we've not really talked about emotion. And
of, I don't know if it's 25, 30 events we've had over the years now, all trying to take on big global challenges from a kind of informal, multidisciplinary, joined up kind of way. And the idea is that we hear some stuff and we have loads of Q&A and we have some discussion, and we try and set up an environment in which, you never know, there might be some new thinking come out of it in some way. And we record it, so you can go onto the ISF Global Futures website and you can find archives of with varying degrees of rigour, we've archived all the different events in the past, and at some stage in the proceedings, probably sometime around 5:30, we'll break, and there will be refreshments and even some wine out there. And sometimes after that, that which is a chance to carry on the discussion. Sometimes we sort of come back in for a bit more of a discussion for those who want to, a sort of smaller group, just to kind of nut into things like, well, what does this mean for us here at Lancaster? So the format's always a little bit different. And I'm just about to hand over to Anne Chapman and John Foster, who are going to run things slightly but not radically different from the normal way we do things, possibly. So it's going to be great to have their take on. I won't say too much about it. I do have a small role in the proceedings as well later on. But it's going to be great to have their take based on their book, Climate Change, Facing Up to Climate Reality, which has got inputs from all kinds of different people, but their whole take on where we're up to and what does it really mean for us. So I'm going to shut up and hand it over to Anne.
Hi, I'm Anne Chapman. I've been in Lancaster for 20 years plus, so I've been involved in many different things in that time, and normally I'm at the audience in these events. So it's a bit daunting being up front. But I'm here, the hat I've got on at the moment, I have many, is Director of Greenhouse Think Tank, and we've just produced this book, Facing Up to Climate Reality. So Greenhouse is an organisation formed of people that live all over the country, so we're not based anywhere, we're a dispersed organisation, and we're about trying to promote debate, develop thinking on green issues in the UK. So the project that this book came out of a discussion that we had in 2015. Every summer we try and have a physical get-together. Normally we just have phone conferences, but every summer we try to meet up. And we had a session at that gathering called How Long Have We Got? And actually we were all really pessimistic about our chances for really stopping climate change and stopping the sort of environmental crisis. And this surprised the person that initiated it, who said, I thought all you lot would turn around and say, oh, don't worry, people sort it out. But actually we didn't say that. But interestingly for me, like the next day, it was like I felt a weight had been lifted because of that conversation. Because I realised there had been things that I've been thinking and feeling for some time, but not talking to anybody about because there was no forum in which to do that, and I didn't feel that it could be said. So I thought we'd start today with a little discussion, just in pairs, about, and I'd like you to talk about when you became worried about climate change, assuming you are, perhaps you're not, you can say that if you're not, and how you feel about it. So perhaps just give each person 2 minutes. So one person has the floor for 2 minutes, and then we'll switch over, and then the other person can say what they feel. So if you could just pair up with somebody next to you. So I'll time you and tell you when to start. I'll just guess.
2 minutes is about
How are you feeling about racing?
Right, so you've had 2 minutes, so Patsy, you can draw to a close and let the other person have their say. I'll give you another 2 minutes.
Just ignoring it. It's You've all started some good conversations that you can always continue later. So, to go back to the story of our project, following that discussion in 2015, we organised a Saturday morning event in Lancaster in January 2016, which some of you might have come to, called Facing Up to Climate Change, which I organised at the Meeting House. And we asked John Foster to come along and speak. And that's how sort of John Foster's become more involved in Greenhouse. And in the following year, we decided to make sort of Facing Up to Climate, well, we changed the title to Facing Up to Climate Reality. We decided to make that our major project for a few years. And we tried to tread the line between the sort of mentality that things are going to be sorted out, we're all going to be all right, we can just carry on much as we are, and the powers that be will fix it. And it's the end of the world, there's no future, therefore we don't need to think about the future. So it's about, you know, thinking between those two of what are things actually going to be like, how do we need to change our mindset as much as anything else. So John Foster's become more involved, and he was the editor of this book, and he's now co-chair of me with Greenhouse. So he's been teaching philosophy at Lancaster for at least 20 years, because he was here when I arrived, and he's still here.
and he's written quite a lot about criticising the discourse of sustainable development. So, John, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you all for coming. So, that was the question on the flyer. Now, of course, this is the Institute for Social Futures, so this is a sociologically alert audience. So the first question you're going to ask is, who the hell are we? Right? Do I mean by we the world at large? Is the world at large facing up to climate reality? Well, clearly not, if the Paris process is anything to go by. Do I mean the great British public? Well, our representatives in Parliament cheerfully declare a climate emergency and then go straight back to picking the Brexit boil. So probably we're not facing up to climate reality through our parliamentary representatives. Do I mean, you know, Greta Thunberg and the school strikers, or Extinction Rebellion people, many of whom I guess will overlap with people in this audience? Are they facing up to climate reality? What I'd like to do to make the question manageable is actually keep it to we here in this room. Are we facing up to climate reality? And you've kind of been kicking around some thoughts of your own about that in the last few minutes. Perhaps we believe that the climate crisis is real and deadly serious. I guess that's probably where we're all starting from, but also that it is still tractable if we start acting on it soon. Perhaps we're inspired by the idea that these are, quote, the make or break years. That's from Mike, who spoke a minute ago, in his recently published book, There Is No Planet B. Is that a yes? Is that facing up to climate reality? Or maybe we recognise that in reality things are going to get much worse up to and including climate-driven disaster, whatever we do. And suppose that that were needed for a yes. Then I guess the question is, how might we confront that situation honestly without giving up hope? And so already, where I've got the whole title of this book into the frame, Facing Up to Climate Reality, Honesty, Disaster and Hope. That book is available from there or from here for a tenner, which is obviously a snip. At which point I should mention that Mike's book is also on sale here for a tenner. So the tenner for our book goes in that box, and the tenner for Mike's book goes, oh, all right, in that box. Okay? And don't expect any change. Here's from the foreword. What is involved, we ask, that's what the book is about, in accepting the inescapability now of real climate-driven disasters, the end of the dream of uninterrupted human progress. We, in the book, probe the barriers to the transformative adaptation, that's a crucial concept, which we now so urgently need. I'll come back to that concept. We recognise that the world is already committed to escalating climate chaos, yet at the same time we refuse to give up hope of avoiding climate catastrophe. Why should one start from there? Well, think about the carbon budget, the global carbon budget. We must live within a budget of between 700 and 800 billion more tonnes of emitted CO2 if we are to have a better than evens chance of keeping warming below 2 degrees C. And at current rates, we use this budget up in something like 19 years. Now, I could have got those figures from anywhere. Actually, I think I got them from Mike's other book with Duncan Clark, The Burning Question, from which I certainly lifted that diagram, which shows the precipice down which we have to go in terms of cutting those emissions if we want the 75% of not exceeding +2 degrees C, starting from a peak today. And of course, don't forget that +2 degrees C is now, according to the informed scientific consensus, too much. We should try and keep it to 1.5. And just to emphasize the magnitude of that task, that's what the Guardian's lovely real-time website, I forget what it's called now, carbon monitoring website. Anyway, Google Guardian carbon and you'll get it. That's the rate. It shows in real time the rate of carbon emissions, and it's running. Last time I looked at 80,000 tonnes per minute, which is 1,300 tonnes per second. Or, just to make that more concrete, 105 Routemaster buses per second. So, I mean, how long have I been talking about? 5 minutes. That means 31,000 plus tonnes, 31,000 plus Routemaster buses worth of the stuff have gone up worldwide into the atmosphere since I started talking. And when you remember that carbon dioxide is a gas, and how far you personally would have to drive to emit just 1 tonne of it, you can't but acknowledge and register the sheer relentless magnitude of the spewing out of this climate destabilising pollutant that is going on across the world. And by the same token, you know, these eye-glazing magnitudes measure the extent of the scale of change, political, economic, social, which would be needed to render even a proportion of that worldwide economic activity carbon neutral even by 2050, which would be too late. Now, excuse me, it shouldn't escape people's notice that change on such a scale is without the faintest shadow of a precedent in human affairs. There is nothing in history remotely like that challenge. Now, you know, some people dispute that point. Andrew Sims from the New Economics Foundation is a case in point. He's got a little video out there on YouTube. If you Google "we can transform the world in 12 years," you will find it, in which he claims that history is full of examples of how we have achieved the seemingly impossible on a very tight time frame. And then you look at the examples he cites, development of the rail network in Britain in the early 19th century, Franklin D. Roosevelt's 100 Days, Britain in 1940, and you realise how completely different they are from the challenge we actually now face. What Sims has demonstrated, again, is the purely unprecedented nature of the situation we now face. Global in extent, largely still invisible, insidiously interwoven with every aspect of our lives and our institutions and our societies, and with no enemy in view except ourselves. There has been nothing like that ever. And what happens if we don't? If we overshoot the carbon budget? Well, we're all familiar with what is predicted. And that is fairly describable as disastrous, I guess. Because it is so horrible a prospect, naturally enough we tend to screen it out by insisting that there is still time to avert any of it. But if we're going to be honest, there are no empirical grounds for hoping that we can avoid disaster on this scale. On the basis of all past human experience, the odds against doing so are just overwhelming. And hope has to meet the condition of realism. Hope as a concept doesn't just mean wanting something nice to come about in the future. Hope is, if you like, wanting under the sign of contingency. You hope for X. If you want X to happen, you recognise that it might not, but you also believe that you're in with a chance of its happening. And empirically speaking, as it were, projecting forward on the basis of past human experience, hope that we can turn this round in time simply doesn't meet that condition of realism. But hope is also non-negotiable. You can't give up. Activists know that hope is what gets them up each morning. Just as a person, you can't give up. Especially as a parent or as a grandparent, which is what brought it home most powerfully to me 18 months ago when my first grandson came along. Future generations are already here. It's no longer, as it were, proleptic and theoretical. You can hold in your arms and, as it were, look at people who are going to experience what was on the previous slide if we don't go on hoping. Hope is non-negotiable, but it's empirically implausible. So we must hope counter-empirically. That is, against the odds, whatever the odds are. And that means, going back to this concept of transformative adaptation, investing hope in, well, transformation, because that happens by definition against the odds. The odds tell you what you can expect on the basis of the forms and patterns that we know from the past. But transformation is by definition a break from those forms and patterns. But we're talking about adaptation to the world as it is, working through disasters that are coming to transform systems and expectations in the hope of avoiding catastrophe. We're working now in the space between disaster, which is no longer plausibly avoidable, and catastrophe, in effect the end of human and other life on Earth, which we may still be able to avoid. Now, I'm here to introduce the book rather than just talk about me, but let me just bring in another book. That's Rebecca Solnit, her book Hope in the Dark, well worth looking at. What I'm saying, I think, is in the spirit of her claim there. Hope is not about what we expect, it is an embrace of the essential unknowability of the world, the breaks from the present, the surprises. That's the kind of hope we now have to invest our energies and our trust in. And pursuing the theme of transformative adaptation, here are selected chapters from our book. Only, let me insist, a taster of the riches which £10 will buy you, but if you like, the ones that most answer to the points I've just been making. So there's a chapter by Richard McNeill Douglas, Could Capitalism Survive the Transition to a Post-Growth Economy? As you might expect, the answer is no. Existing capitalism builds in a growth imperative which makes climate disaster inevitable. Rupert Reed from University of East Anglia and Kristen Steele write about how we might make the best of climate disasters by letting them produce opportunities to rebuild local communities, local economies, local resilience. Anne, who will talk about her own chapter in a bit.
2015 next time.
Is it 2015? Sorry, no, I'm bound to be some mistake. I thought it was over Christmas.
No. That was elsewhere.
The 2015 Lancaster floods. And Nadine Andrews and Paul Hoggett. Nadine is with us, and I'm sure will say something about this herself later on, so I'm not going to speak for her, but exploring the psychosocial dimensions of this, of resistance to acknowledging climate disaster. And in each case, what we're looking at is a transformative mode of response. Find new modes of economic plurality and freedom. Don't just joke the market, but respect environmental limits. A radical change from anything we've got now. Shift all political and economic arrangements towards seizing these chances. Defragilise our enabling arrangements for everyday life, and we'll talk more about that. Build resilience for acceptance, for grieving, as an essential part of the way to action. So that gives you just a taster of the kind of way we're approaching the idea of transformative adaptation and the basis on which we're doing so. I'd just like to finish by flagging up my own theme, my own chapter in this book, which asks, I talk about counter-empirical hope, hope against the odds, whatever the odds are. Isn't that just utopian? I mean, if our hopes are free from empirical constraint, can't we just hope for anything? Why not hope for the final triumph of universal peace and love to stop any of this happening in the first place? Hope has to be realistic, as I've already said, and utopianism doesn't face up to climate or indeed to any other kind of reality. Counter-empirical hope, the sort that others in the book, that Solnit and others are now talking about, isn't by definition kept realistic by attending to the odds. The odds are overwhelmingly against us. That's why we turn to counter-empirical hope. But it has to be kept realistic. And how do we do that? Well, I think by attention to the essentially tragic conditions of human life and human creativity. We have radical agency, we can bring about the new, we can foster the unprecedented and the transformative, but only through value conflict, actual conflict, grief and loss. That's the human condition. In dealing with this situation now, we forget that at our peril. So, that, if you like, is my spin, personal spin on all this. But I hope I've also given you enough of a flavour of the book as a whole to interest you in engaging with us in dialogue, and perhaps also to acquire a copy. Thank you.
I was thinking perhaps we could hold questions and discussion for the end. Is that all right? Unless anybody's got anything particularly burning they want to take up with John? Because if not, I think Mike is going to respond. Would you like to? You don't need any introduction, do you? Everybody knows.
Okay.
Mike Berners-Lee, Small World Consulting, Oxford University.
Great. Okay, so I mean, I'm interested to hear everyone's response, but I did say I'd do a quick response. I mean, I think it's such an interesting question, this whole thing about, are we doomed, and how to position this, what's realistic, and hope and disaster, or what? And certainly one I think about a lot. And I admire your attempt, by the way, to make climate change tangible by doing carbon dioxide in terms of buses.
Well, I was at a presentation last week when I wasn't allowed to use slides, and it was in London, so I had to use buttons.
So I think my one-liner on what you've got is that I'm basically with you on just about on most of it. So you put up against, sort of, is it like I portray it in the book, the make or break years, or is it that things are going to get worse? And I think it's not either or. I think it's both. I think in terms of climate and disasters around the world and stuff, it has to be both. It's clear cut that in terms of climate, things are going to get worse. I think when you talk about, it's absolutely clear that if you look at global human response to climate change, at the moment there is not a trace of a dent in that carbon curve. There's not a trace of evidence that we're at all able to have any agency over it. And so it's clear that if we're going to get on top of it, what's needed is really, really deep change. And it's not even just climate change. I mean, there's a whole thing about, there is an urgent need for really deep human evolution rapidly. And it's about everything about how we think, what our values are, how we do everything about how we run our lives, just our capacity for all kinds of different thinking. So it's really deep change. There's no doubt about that. The bit about the odds, I'm not sure I can kind of go with. I'm not sure you can calculate the odds on this. It's definitely true that it's something different from what we've ever seen before. So I just look at it. Some people say, I get feedback from my book that people say, well, that's I'm just getting used to what a depressing message it is. And some people say, I really love the optimism. And I think it all depends where your start point is. So if your start point is that we've had it, because you look at humans' capacity to respond in a way that's appropriate and to date, and it's clearly, has been woefully inadequate. And if you take that as what we're capable of, then clearly we've had it. But on the other hand, if you take it that, actually, because we might be capable of something we've never yet achieved, then it's not proven that we're doomed, then that could be a really optimistic message. And I think, I feel more now than I did 5 years ago. I feel as though it's not proven that we're doomed. And I feel as though actually, the signs that humans might be capable of the kind of waking up, the kind of real waking up that's required, I don't know. But for me, it boils down to whether you're a determinist or not. I'm not a determinist, and therefore it's not proven, and there's everything to play for. And so I don't know if it's possible to assess the odds. It's just kind of, if we're going to go down, I'd rather go down fighting. And I actually think if I'm going to be really, so what can we hope for and what can't we hope for? I mean, I did a lot of thinking while you were talking there. I don't hope not to die. And I don't hope that my kids won't die. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't make me, it is quite an uncomfortable reality, I suppose. But it doesn't make me not, it doesn't make me depressed for the future. So we have to be realistic. If I were to be as optimistic as it's possible for the best scenario for how we might get on top of this, I can kind of, maybe this is being naive, but I can kind of imagine a situation in which, whilst we suddenly, become even more scared than any of us are now about the future we're heading for, because the science is really, really getting scary, and we should all of us be probably more scared than we are about it. Whilst that's probably going to be the case, I can imagine a situation in which actually we get off our butts collectively and suddenly we feel great about it, because there's kind of a big lifting of a cloud, because I can imagine a situation in which the feeling in which we all suddenly start knowing we're doing the right thing, I could imagine in one sense that could feel great, actually, in a way that we've never known, because I think it does hang around us like a lead weight, that we know deep down that everything about how we're doing life at the moment is just, well, not how it should be. So yeah, but I thought that was I think it's really such an interesting question, this whole thing, because we have to be realistic, we have to try and have hope. Oh no, we don't have to try and have hope. It doesn't work at all to try and be hopeful just because humans need to be hopeful. You have to just see it how it is, right? Yeah. So thank you. I thought it was really interesting. Yeah.
Right, so I'm just going to say a few things about. Do you want to sort this out for me? We'll do the technical stuff. So, as John's mentioned, my contribution to this book is called Dealing with Extreme Weather, and it draws a lot on the experience here in Lancaster of Storm Desmond. Because I think the power cut in particular, that was sort of, lots of places are flooded, but this is one of the few major urban areas that has had a significant power cut since the 1970s. And it sort of revealed how dependent we've become on electricity in new ways in over the last 40 years. It's no longer just a matter of having candles in stock and gathering the family all in one room to sit by the fire. As I remember that being depicted on TV information things during the 3-day week in the 1970s when I was growing up. That's what a power cut meant. You sort of got out your candles and sat by the fire. And now we've discovered it's all a bit different. So what can we learn from that experience of coping with extreme weather and something like our electricity supply being withdrawn? And even though John said, our focus is all on the... So how do I move on?
Just click the left click.
Oh, right, left click. It's on, so that's the... So what is on a transformative adaptation, that's what the words. The phrase, the term I prefer to use actually is we need to think of how we can cope. And coping is better, to me, to think about than adaptation, because adaptation suggests some sort of gradual process of change so that we can be better fitted to our environment. But when it comes to extreme weather, we don't know what that environment's going to be, quite what's going to happen, and we need to be able to foster the ability to react, whatever happens, to react appropriately. So just for those of you who was here in December 2015, well, most of you were around. So that was the bottom of town in the early hours of Sunday, 6th of December. So the I don't know what that's doing up there. The Saturday was when it all happened, where we got all the rain, and then Sunday was that beautiful day when everybody went down to the river and looked at the raging torrent. I remember standing there and somebody saying, "It's low tide at the moment." And you think, oh my God. So there was a lot of water around. But importantly, as much as the flooding in the town centre was devastating for those particularly involved, it was the flooding of the power station. So that's the substation. I mean, that's the substation in the middle of the night, all flooded. And this is why so this is the substation here, and this is an old picture. And I think that's the power station. So this is this is one of the things that we're faced with. We've got all this infrastructure, which is where it is for all these historical reasons. So the substation that serves the whole district is on the floodplain next to the river, because that is where the power station was. When there was a coal-fired power station, so it had water for cooling, and the railway line bringing coal in from Yorkshire. So, we've got all these historical things that aren't ideal when it comes to thinking about extreme weather and rising, more intense rainfall, more flooding and all that sort of stuff. So, and that power cut, of course, a few people were affected by the flooding devastatingly. A lot of people were affected by the power cut. Perhaps it wasn't so critical for those people, but that's an illustration of, I think, the secondary effects of flooding and extreme weather often are much more sort of widespread. So, you had the road being washed away up in Cumbria. And that had a big impact on lots of people's lives for months afterwards. So the impacts of the pack and what we discovered when you don't have electricity. One of the critical things is communication. There's you've got no internet, no mobile signal, you've only got a landline if you've got one of those phones that you actually physically plug into the wall. We've since been out and bought one that we just keep in the cupboard, because those ones that you carry around the house don't work. So everybody needs to have one in their cupboard for just in case. So actually, to find out what's going on, you had to go out. That's the nice thing about it. You had to go out and walk around the street and talk to people to find out what was happening. Doors. Now I haven't, there's a few things here about interconnectivity, entry phones, electrically operated doors not working. I met some people a while after who'd walked over the Carlisle Bridge to go and visit an elderly person they knew who lived in flats near the bus station. But they couldn't get in, and they couldn't contact her, because the intercom didn't work. So there's no way of them telling her that they were there. And there are all sorts of other stories about, doors having electrically operated locks. So there was something, this is I got from there was a radio programme that talked a little bit about the Lancaster floods. And somebody from a care home somebody had to sit by the door all night because they couldn't lock the door because it was all electrically operated. So I think, the lesson is that doors you should always be able to open, close, lock and unlock them without electricity. And, this dependence on electricity is a real fragility in our system. Another thing, no chairlifts, alarm systems, oxygen supply. So all vulnerable people living at home, reliant on all those things, that's another huge vulnerability. So I know somebody whose husband is on oxygen. She was sort of advised in the end, so she got somebody to carry him down the stairs from the flat where they lived, put him in the car. Fortunately, she said she just about had enough petrol in the car, though it was a bit dodgy, and to take him to a hotel for a couple of days, because his 12 hours of battery for the oxygen had just about been used up. So, she had no help from social services. And, fortunately she had a car, and she was able to afford to go and stay at a hotel. So there are all these vulnerabilities that we discovered. There are no pumps, so you can't get any petrol to petrol station or diesel, or water in flats where you've got to. So people in flats are really, if you're in a house, we live in a house with a wood-burning stove and a gas cooker, we were sort of fine.
Modern gas cookers don't work without electricity. I have an old one. Everybody came to me.
There's another. I'll talk about it in a minute. Actually, the care home up at the top, they've got a gas cooker, but it only worked if the extractor fan was on. So it's all these safety systems, that are great, but so they couldn't use their gas cooker. A really good thing about the Lancaster power cut was that Roger Kemp, who's a professor in the engineering department, he sort of took the initiative to organise a seminar, a meeting in the following March, and got a load of people together to find out their experiences. So this is a really good report, Living Without Electricity, that brought together all this stuff. And it's a real load in here for us to learn from, I think, about how to do, it was electricity supply now, it could be something else, but, other things might cause the electricity supply failure, not just flooding, perhaps. And one of the interesting things he talks about is the diffusion of responsibility for critical systems between organisations and also geographically. So the Scotforth Primary School, their alarm was monitored in Belfast. So, what good is that? When the head teacher, their phone doesn't work, or they can't, it's just that sort of, and there's all sorts of things, the manager of the train station is based in Carlisle, all that sort of stuff. There was no information for people like head teachers, vice chancellors, etc. Apparently the vice chancellor of the university ended up phoning up people, so he must have had one of these plug-in phones, phoning up people who lived outside the affected area to get them to look on the internet to find out what was going on, because you've got that whole lack of communication problem. So this does, I think this, this report, it gives quite a few examples of situations where people took initiatives and muddled through. So that care home I talked about, one of the family of one of the residents, they brought in a camper van to make tea, coffee, and a barbecue. So the chef was cooking on a barbecue outside in the garden. 6th of December. Fortunately, it was nice weather that day. But also of instances where that sort of, doing what's necessary in the situation didn't happen. So, for example, Booth Supermarket in Scotforth, that was one of the few shops that was open because they had a backup generator. But it was Sunday and they closed at 4 o'clock, even though it's absolutely packed. Because of the Sunday trading laws. Because there was nobody there who was able to take the decision to override that sort of situation. So, do we need some sort of the ability to declare a local emergency where certain sort of things could be suspended, for example, or some sort of system of way of getting a local, because you've always got to think, when it comes down to these situations, what you need is people on the ground there, not some sort of control from outside. So I thought we'd just spend a few minutes talking in threes and fours and thinking about how, you might want to think about your experience of Storm Desmond, or think